Welcome to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss science fiction, fantasy, cooking, the outdoors, and more. In this continuation of my video series regarding my declining interest in the Star Wars franchise, I will be exploring a set of issues that can all be described as wasted opportunities. My declining interest is in stark contrast to my original love for the franchise that ignited when I first saw Star Wars 4: A New Hope, which was the first Star Wars film that I had ever seen. As I described in the previous video of this series, which should be linked above, the subsequent films of Star Wars 5: The Empire Strikes Back and Star Wars 6: Return of the Jedi only increased my love for the franchise. While I wasn't as enthusiastic about the prequels when they came out years later, they didn't adversely impact my love for the franchise. And in the years since they premiered, I have grown to appreciate them more now than I had when they first came out. Then, on the heels of the two animated series that I liked, Star Wars: The Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, George Lucas made the fateful decision to sell his beloved franchise and movie studio that he founded, Lucasfilm, to the Disney Company at the end of 2012. He had previously made Kathleen Kennedy the president of Lucasfilm earlier in 2012, which at the time didn't seem like a bad idea to me. But the broken promises that she made to George Lucas and to all the fans to protect his characters and universe that he created when he decided to sell Star Wars and Lucasfilm to Disney led to some very poor decisions for what, in my opinion, is Disney's ill-fated and poorly conceived sequel trilogy. So what exactly is a wasted opportunity? I define a wasted opportunity as a failure to take advantage of a set of unique circumstances that have come together at the same time and made it possible to accomplish something that is both special and unique within itself. And several unique circumstances had come together in late 2012 and early 2013. Since new Star Wars movies aren't made that often, the fact that Disney was willing to finance the filming of 3 new sequel trilogy films was a unique circumstance, especially since the intent was to tell stories that would be coming after the final original trilogy film, 1983's Return of the Jedi. The second unique circumstance is that given it had been 30 years since Return of the Jedi had been produced and released, the actors who had portrayed 3 of the most important and iconic fictional characters in the original trilogy were, at the time, still alive. Mark Hamill, who had played Luke Skywalker, Carrie Fisher, who had played Princess Leia, and Harrison Ford, who had played Han Solo. The third unique circumstance is that, as far as the fans knew, these 3 iconic characters were still alive within the fictional Star Wars universe. Fourth, before George Lucas had sold Star Wars and Lucasfilm to Disney, he had already signed these 3 actors to reprise their roles for a new sequel trilogy. Fifth, also before selling Star Wars and Lucasfilm to Disney at the end of 2012, George Lucas had written treatments for what he was planning to do in the sequel trilogy. These are the same treatments that Lucas gave to Disney as a starting point for the expected sequel trilogy films. Sixth, George Lucas had already hired a screenwriter, Michael Arndt, who had begun scripting his treatments for the sequel trilogy. Finally, beyond these 6 circumstances, there was one that had existed for more than 20 years at that point in time. There was a treasure trove of novels, comic books, and video games that had been created by a large number of people that provided various scenarios for what happened after the conclusion of Return of the Jedi. These works, while they had not been created by George Lucas himself, were viewed as being canon and were collectively known as the Expanded Universe, or the EU for short. During the late 2012 interview between Kathleen Kennedy and George Lucas, in which she made her infamous phony promise to George and the fans, George Lucas talked about the EU, saying that these materials were readily available for Disney and Lucasfilm to draw from in order to develop new movies. Thus, the EU was effectively a seventh unique circumstance. So when Disney CEO Bob Iger announced on October 30th, 2012, that Disney was purchasing Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise from Lucas, and that the first new sequel trilogy film would be released in 2015, Disney and Lucasfilm appear to have already been set up to produce 3 good sequel trilogy films. But in spite of these unique circumstances that existed at the time, Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy made other choices. The treatments that George Lucas had given to Bob Iger and Kathleen Kennedy were a blueprint for the sequel trilogy that he had already planned out. But Bob Iger, as he admitted in his published memoirs, didn't want to use George Lucas's treatments, and he had in fact misled George into believing that that's what he was going to use for Disney's sequel trilogy. As shared in a 2019 Hollywood Reporter article, Iger admitted this in his memoirs that were entitled The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company. In it, Iger explained that the purchase of Lucas's sequel trilogy treatments was made only out of a sense of obligation to Lucas, writing, "We decided we needed to buy them, though we made clear in the purchase agreement that we would not be contractually obligated to adhere to the plot lines he'd laid out." Disney and Lucasfilm didn't follow Lucas's lead for the new movies, a decision Lucas discovered when Lucasfilm had Kathleen Kennedy and Star Wars The Force Awakens writers J.J. Abrams and Michael Arndt met to discuss the new trilogy and specifically the 2015 installment. Iger wrote, "George immediately got upset as they began to describe the plot, and it dawned on him that we weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. George knew we weren't contractually bound to anything, but he thought that our buying the story treatments was a tacit promise that we'd follow them, and he was disappointed that his story was being discarded. I'd been so careful since our first conversation not to mislead him in any way, and I didn't think I had now, but I could have handled it better. George felt betrayed, and while this whole process would never have been easy for him, we'd gotten off to an unnecessarily rocky start." And thus we have our first wasted opportunity, George Lucas's deliberately unused sequel trilogy treatments, which all cross out on the list of unique circumstances that had come together. But think about it. If you had the treatments for a sequel trilogy from the franchise creator, why would you want to toss them aside and write your own thing? It made absolutely no sense, and it set the stage for the cinematic and narrative failures that were to come. In spite of the fact that Star Wars 7: The Force Awakens did incredibly well at the box office and was extremely popular with the fans. That excitement would prove to be very short-lived, and that film set everyone up to be massively disappointed when the next 2 installments were released. The deliberate decision not to use Lucas's sequel trilogy treatments was by no means the only wasted opportunity in Disney's sequel trilogy. When J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan wrote the script for The Force Awakens, they had merely copied the plot of Star Wars 4: A New Hope. Abrams had admitted this in 2016 when talking with Chris Rock at the Tribeca Film Festival, saying that he borrowed from Star Wars 4: A New Hope with the excuse that fans needed something familiar. But this isn't what Michael Arndt, the screenwriter hired by Lucas, had written. Arndt's script had been based on Lucas's treatments, so it's no wonder that Kathleen Kennedy fired him in October of 2013. Thus, directly connected with the first wasted opportunity is the second wasted opportunity, the firing of Michael Arndt and the replacement of his script, which had more heavily featured Luke Skywalker alongside Rey, instead of having Abrams' rehash of A New Hope, with Luke only showing up for a few seconds at the end of the film with no lines. I think it's safe to say that everyone who saw The Force Awakens probably would have preferred a much stronger presence from Luke Skywalker than what actually got produced. And in fact, Abrams also admitted at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2016 that the diminishment of Luke in The Force Awakens made Mark Hamill reluctant to return to the franchise at all. So now we can cross off another unique circumstance from the original list that we started with, and we'll flag the fourth one to show that this one was nearly lost altogether. For the third wasted opportunity, we have to jump ahead a few years to look at something in that dumpster fire of a film, Star Wars IX: The Rise of Skywalker, which J.J. Abrams also co-wrote and which sits prominently among my list of unwatchable films. According to a December 2019 IGN article, Episode 9 co-writer Chris Terrio claimed it was Kathleen Kennedy's idea to bring back Palpatine. Originally, fired director Colin Trevorrow had said that it had been J.J. Abrams' idea, but Terrio said, Kathy Kennedy and Senior Vice President Michelle Rejwan had a clear plan for where they wanted things to end. They had clear plans about certain narrative marks they wanted us to hit. They also gave us a lot of freedom within that. We knew that Rey and Ren were utterly key to the trilogy, but we also felt that there was no way that we were going to find a path to redemption for Kylo Ren, the son of Han and Leia. When asked if Palpatine had always been the plan prior to Episode 9, Terrio said, well, I can't speak to Kathy's overall intent. That was certainly discussed and was discussed before I ever came on. Kathy had this overall vision that we had to be telling the same story for 9 episodes. Although from the sleight of hand of Episode 7 and Episode 8, you wouldn't necessarily know immediately that we were telling the same story. She thought it would be a very strong end for the 9th movie. This fits well with JJ because he loves magic tricks. Given the lack of congruence between the 3 sequel trilogy films, wouldn't it have made a lot more sense to have Palpatine return in The Force Awakens instead of dumping it onto the fandom in the 3rd and final film with absolutely no buildup whatsoever? The third wasted opportunity was Disney declaring the entire EU to be Legends and not canon in early 2013, because there was a perfectly good method created by Tom Veitch in the 1991 and 1992 comic book series Star Wars Dark Empire by which Palpatine could return, by transferring his consciousness into a cloned body. Had Abrams and Kasdan introduced this in The Force Awakens, not only would that movie not have been a total rehash of A New Hope, it would have provided a way for Kathleen Kennedy to have Palpatine return without retconning Luke and Anakin's triumph over the Emperor at the end of Return of the Jedi. Dark Empire had long established this precedent, but instead of following this method, Abrams and Terrio chose to have Palpatine magically survive being thrown down into the second Death Star and its subsequent explosion with absolutely no prior buildup whatsoever. The failure of Kennedy, Abrams, Kasdan, and Terrio to use an established method for the Emperor to return, combined with the failure to make that the central focus of the sequel trilogy, is actually a fourth and completely wasted opportunity to effectively use the EU, which George Lucas himself had pointed out in 2012 was available for them to use. Kennedy, Abrams, Kasdan, Terrio, and Rian Johnson failed to develop a coherent narrative that would tie the 3 sequel trilogy films together. And they could have used part of Lucas's treatments for the sequel trilogy because it had a cohesive narrative that presumably would have tied the 3 films together. And the principal villain would have been Darth Maul. So had they used that, they wouldn't have had to bother bringing back Palpatine at all. The fifth wasted opportunity is a byproduct of the previous 4. I, like most every other Star Wars fan, had wanted to see the 3 iconic characters of Luke, Leia, and Han on screen together again, because that had not happened since the release of Return of the Jedi in 1983, 32 years before the release of The Force Awakens. But did J.J. Abrams, who directed and co-wrote The Force Awakens with Lawrence Kasdan, include such a scene? No. And when Abrams and Kasdan killed off the character of Han Solo in The Force Awakens, it then became impossible for the 3 iconic characters to ever appear on screen together again. This became even more impossible with the unfortunate death of Carrie Fisher in December 2016. Thus, 2 more of the unique circumstances that had existed in 2012 and early 2013 can be scratched off. Not all of the actors were still alive, and one of the iconic characters had been killed off without ever being able to have the three of them together on screen again. Had they preserved more of Michael Arndt's original script for The Force Awakens, in which Luke Skywalker would have played a more prominent role in the film, then having the three iconic characters together again would have likely happened. This failure and the fifth wasted opportunity is directly attributable to J.J. Abrams, Lawrence Kasdan, and Kathleen Kennedy. The sixth wasted opportunity has to do with one of the three new characters that were created for Disney's sequel trilogy: Poe Dameron, Finn, and Rey. Of these three, the one that truly stood out and was by far the most interesting was the character of Finn as portrayed by John Boyega. Finn had been raised to become an obedient killing machine stormtrooper like all other stormtroopers, but he wasn't the same. He didn't want to kill, and he chose to escape the First Order. Then, over the course of The Force Awakens, we watched Finn transform from someone who cowardly only wanted to escape the First Order into dueling the First Order's champion Kylo Ren with a lightsaber and nearly getting himself killed in defense of Rey. Finn's character growth throughout The Force Awakens was one of the highlights of the movie. But there was a problem. Audiences in China apparently don't like people of color, so much so that Disney deliberately shrunk his image on movie posters that were used in China to promote the film, as compared with similar posters used everywhere else. Not only does this demonstrate Disney's complete hypocrisy when it comes to their claims of pushing representation and diversity, their hypocrisy was even more evident when in Star Wars VIII: The Last Jedi, the character of Finn had been demoted from being a main character into a secondary comic relief character, who had completely backslid into being a coward again thanks to Rian Johnson's retconning and emasculation. This was undoubtedly done to make Finn more palatable to racist Chinese audiences, which is why Rian Johnson created a boring side plot for him with the character Rose Tico, who was played by actress Kelly Marie Tran, who is of Asian descent. And when Abrams and Terrio wrote Episode 9, they kept Finn in the background, and his most memorable contribution to that dumpster fire of a film was him repeatedly yelling Rey's name. Rey! What a complete wasted opportunity. Finn could have become another Jedi alongside Rey. His character could have been even more developed in Episodes 8 and 9, but instead he was pushed down into obscurity. For me personally, this diminishment of Finn's character was by itself a significant factor in my declining interest in Star Wars. And again, who's to blame for this? Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams, Lawrence Kasdan, Chris Terrio, and Rian Johnson. Since this video is getting long, I'll only mention a few other wasted opportunities. Rey being an overpowered Mary Sue, which made her unlikable and few could identify with her. She should have been less perfect and have had to actually learn about the Force. Kylo Ren was emotionally stunted, immature, and obsessed with emulating Darth Vader, which he never actually achieved because he was too emotionally stunted and immature. He could have been far more imposing and interesting like Darth Vader, but thanks to poor writing, his character languished between laughingstock and waste of time. Even the annoying spoiled brat character of Veruca Salt from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which Kylo Ren behaves like to some degree, is far more interesting and entertaining than him. Poe Dameron was too cocky and sure of himself. Then he was turned into a mutineer, until in Episode 9 he suddenly had the inexplicable ability to fly in and out of lightspeed like a madman. Like Rey and Kylo Ren, his character suffered throughout the sequel trilogy due to inadequate character development. In each of these three cases, Rey, Kylo Ren, and Poe became predictable thanks to poor writing. And the character of Rose Tico could have been far more interesting also had she not been obsessed with saving alien racehorses and stopping Finn from destroying a massive First Order weapon to save the Resistance by claiming that the way to defeat the First Order was through love, which was about the most out-of-place line I have ever heard in a Star Wars film. In closing this video, I'm interested in hearing what you may think are wasted opportunities in the Disney Star Wars sequel trilogy, as well as whether you agree or disagree with any of the ones that I cited. I'd also like to hear whether the sequel trilogy in any way lowered your own love and interest in the Star Wars franchise. Please let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching today, and thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our YouTube channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button below, and please feel free to share a comment. If you would like to see more of our videos in the future and help support this channel, please subscribe right now by clicking on the red subscribe button below. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.